a nation perched on the far western edge of the world, or so it must have seemed in ancient times, a place where the sun could be seen sinking into the bounded waters of Oceanus, where legend said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear the sizzle as it dipped beneath the waves. Though sometimes overshadowed by their larger neighbor in Iberia, the Portuguese have their own unique origins, which can be traced back through genetics, culture, and language for thousands of years. A land of mountains and sea, of stunning highlands and dreamy fields, of majestic castles and forests to float Neptune's fleet, ceramics to draw the eye, and loquacious bards to ensnare the mind. The Portuguese people played a massively oversized role in shaping the modern world, and these are their origins. Modern humans have been living in the area of Portugal for around 20,000 years. Thousands of enigmatic rock carvings exist from these early Western hunter-gatherers, depicting mostly the animals they hunted to survive. And the site of Foz Coa in northeastern Portugal represents the largest open-air collection of such art from this period in Iberia. They had a darker complexion as compared to modern Europeans, but their closest modern genetic relatives are Western Europeans. Not much changed until around 5500 BC, when a new people began appearing across southern Portugal. Anatolian farmers, frequently called the early European farmers, and they established themselves across Europe and ushered in a new age, the Neolithic. They were, as their name suggests, primarily agriculturalists, and they brought with them a plethora of technological advances and cultural practices that were to reshape Europe. They appear to have been patriarchal and patrilocal. Families were buried together in common plots. They built many wondrous places. It had previously been believed, due to the similarity of the large megalithic constructions in the Atlantic zone, that there was active trade and communication from Britain all the way to Portugal. But more recently, it's thought that these traditions developed largely independently. There is not much evidence for trade or migration between these areas. Yet unlike in some other regions of Europe, the hunter-gatherers of Portugal were not quickly absorbed into the early farmers, nor did they die off. They were both living in Portugal simultaneously for a long time. Neolithic farmer men were marrying hunter-gatherer women, and this led to a higher degree of Iberian hunter-gatherer ancestry in the Neolithic farmer population, an estimated 32%. Finally, around 3100 BC, copper technology begins to spread through Portugal. The spread of this technology didn't represent an incoming population. The technology had been shared through Mediterranean contact and spread from tribe to tribe throughout Iberia. Yet this is where our true mystery begins. Not long after the introduction of copper technology into Iberia, the Bell Beaker culture emerged, with its earliest known evidence dating to around 2800 BC, near the mouth of the Tagus River, approximately where Lisbon is today. The copper-working culture who established a stronghold of Castro do Sambuia may have been the origin of the Bell Beaker culture, and the oldest known artifacts associated with it have been found there. They had a large, powerful stone fortress with 3 to 7 meter high stone walls and semicircular towers, something completely unique for the time period in Western Europe. Their power and wealth was something to behold. The culture is named for the signature beaker associated with it, and its style was the result of a local Portuguese development. These Beaker people would, over the next few hundred years, expand out from Portugal, traveling south down to the Mediterranean and establishing themselves in southern France and Italy. But they would also go north along the Atlantic coast, creating settlements as far as Brittany. This group of Bell Beakers are known as the Maritime Beakers, to distinguish them from what was to follow. Now, this very impressive Maritime Beaker culture's connection to the later Beaker culture, after around 2500 BC, is murky indeed. The original Beaker culture was not Proto-Indo-European. And yet, when the Beaker culture most impressively bursts into history with the conquest of Britain and its expansion as spread throughout Western and Central Europe, they spoke an Indo-European dialect that would become the parent of both Celtic and Italic families, and had around 50% Eastern European steppe herder genetic admixture. There must have been some connection between these people, but they do not appear to have been strongly genetically linked. The cultural package also spread into Central Europe, into what is now Hungary. By 2200 BC, the Beaker style that had begun in Portugal would return in a big way under new hands. Before 2500, there was zero admixture from any Eastern European steppe-derived population in Portugal. The major male haplogroups were I2 and G2, but that was going to change dramatically. Sometime after 2500 BC, a demographic tsunami swept across Western Europe. While much of southern Spain was not as highly affected, genetic evidence shows that Portugal was one of the most affected places in Iberia by this migration. By between 2200 and 2000 BC, individuals showed 40% admixture from a steppe-derived migrant population. The earliest detected steppe ancestry appeared in the north, as showing that this population was moving in boats along the Atlantic coasts of Iberia. They were likely moving inland by rivers and taking up whatever looked to be an advantageous position. These were not farmers. These were war bands who aimed at seizing control of key resources, land, and women. The direct evidence for this is that alongside the general genetic shift, there was a dramatic shift in the Y DNA lineages. The Y DNA represents the male genetic lines. The Neolithic male lines were eviscerated, showing a near total replacement. That later descendants would still carry more early farmer ancestry is due to Bell Beaker men likely taking multiple early farmer women as wives or slaves. The female population was likely larger than the male population, and there were very few Bell Beaker women who made the journey to Portugal. This is shown through continuity on the female line, showing that the migration was strongly male-driven. If we compare what seems to have happened in Portugal, it may also shed light on what probably happened in Britain and Ireland, where there was less than 10% British Neolithic admixture into the subsequent Bronze Age population. Due to their proximity to Central Europe and vast numbers of their own tribes, the people migrating into Britain and Ireland brought their own women. In the far western reaches, however, where perhaps only the bravest and most violent men ranged, there was a greater need to take local women. Like later raiding bands such as the Vikings, this process did not happen in a single wave, but in wave after wave over several centuries. Some of these Bell Beaker folk have been found buried in Portugal with 100% Central European type Bell Beaker ancestry. The process, while unfolding over a few hundred years, was not especially slow. By 2100 BC, even in the southern tip of Portugal, everyone had at least some steppe ancestry, averaging between 30 and 40% Central European Bell Beaker ancestry. They had mixed fully with the local Neolithic population, which still made up around 60% of their ancestry. But the male lines had radically changed, along undoubtedly with their language. It is the people who emerged out of this transformative event that form the bedrock of the later Bronze, Iron, and even modern Portuguese population, though there would be many more interesting additions along the way. Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean, and I have a book here that you really should check out. Now, Heroes of Tara is not just a 5th edition D&D game book. It is so much more. It's a complete history of the Celts, and specifically the Gaels. It provides a clear historical presentation of the Gaels, their society, their day-to-day life, their political organization, and their religion. It breaks down different aspects of different gods, and provides an outline of all the major mythological events. Now, even if you're not interested in playing D&D, but you're interested in the Celts, I would highly recommend this book, because it actually serves as a very beautiful and well-organized encyclopedia on Celtic mythology and history. It goes through many aspects of Celtic life, lays it out in a very well-organized manner, and with beautiful imagery. Now, I was actually consulted in the making of this book, but actually the author didn't have to be told to make any corrections because I found it to be extremely authoritative. For the D&D player, it has many great aspects to it. Now, he has created entirely new classes that reflect the ancient Gaelic society, and he has tailored the magic system to accurately reflect the magic as presented in Gaelic mythology. So it's not only a wonderful game, but it is an amazing book for anyone interested in Celtic history and mythology, and I highly recommend it. Following the link in the description of the video will take you to a page where you can either get a hard copy like this, or you can get a PDF copy. I'd like to give a salute to Jacob Dirksen, who put this together. It's a wonderful piece of art. The period following the Rhine-Beaker conquest of Portugal was one tied together along the Atlantic zone, sometimes called the Atlantic Bronze Age. The larger group tombs were abandoned, and individual kist burials with grave goods like those of Ireland and Britain, or small tholos or beehive-shaped tombs, somewhat similar to Mycenaeans, became the norm. Stone stelae, possibly representing deceased warriors, became popular sometime around 1700 BC, which was a feature that they shared with other Central European groups, but which was not carried on by the British or the Irish. Beautiful works of art in gold and bronze survive from this time period as just a small fragment of what would have existed. They were extremely skilled metalworkers and artisans. Long-distance trade is also shown via amber beads from the North Sea and gold from Ireland and Britain. By around 1800 BC in the north of Portugal, they were obtaining tin, and despite a tin mine located in Galicia, northern Spain, much of the tin was being sourced from Britain. As elsewhere in Europe, true tin bronze thus appeared first in northern Portugal, closer to Britain, and did not reach the south until around 1500 BC. The so-called halberd was a very popular weapon across much of the Bell Beaker descended cultures, and examples in Portugal are so similar to those in Ireland that it's difficult to distinguish them. Yet it wasn't only their weapons that were similar. From the onset of the arrival of the Rhine Beakers in Portugal, roundhouses became the predominant style of dwelling, a style shared with those of Britain and Ireland. The style would continue through the Iron Age Castro culture, but eventually died out due to Romanization. Now, it's tempting to think that the medieval Gaelic stories that tie Ireland's history to that of northern Iberia contain some memory of this ancient connection, and perhaps they do. Yet despite these close cultural and economic ties between Portugal and the Atlantic zone, genetic studies indicate that there was only minimal continuous genetic exchange along this zone. Goods and ideas were being transported, but there wasn't much resettlement or intermixing of populations, at least not until the late Bronze Age. Despite what was almost certainly the warlike nature of the earlier Rhine Beaker community, they didn't build large defended settlements like some of the earlier Neolithic cultures had. Theirs tended to be smaller, unfortified villages. They were more individualistic. They first continued habitation of the Neolithic hill towns, but as these sites degraded over time, they moved into the lowlands. Cattle raiding and other forms of ritualized violence between tribes was probably frequent, but there was little sign of large-scale warfare. Those of Portugal would have been speaking a dialect or several dialects of Western Indo-European, the same branch which would have been spoken in Britain and Ireland and throughout regions of Central Europe where the Bell Beakers had spread. Yet around 1300 BC, this seemingly relatively relaxed lifestyle of undefended villages, based on subsistence farming, would shift dramatically. Hill forts began to be constructed, showing an increased centralization of power and a dramatic shift towards martial glorification. Stone stelae in the south of Portugal begin featuring Urnfield-style weapons and armor, depictions of chariot-riding warriors, and local pottery begins imitating Urnfield styles from Central Europe. While previously it had been believed that this increased Urnfieldization of Portugal was due to cultural influence, genetic studies have now demonstrated that this cultural influence was due to population movement. The Proto-Celts of the Urnfield culture, as early as 1300 BC, were already impacting the westernmost shores of continental Europe. The earliest centralization and remilitarization of the Portuguese late Bronze Age population may have been in response to the Urnfield expansion much further to their east, and the ripple effects that it was having throughout western France and into Iberia. The introduction of a more militant culture with Urnfield-style armor and weapons would eventually be followed by the Urnfield warriors themselves. The Urnfield culture was as technologically and socially sophisticated as they were expansionist and warlike. Ruled by divinely infused kings, directed under the laws and teachings of druids, financed by the salt mines and fueled by an elevated class of artisans who were afforded high honors in the society. They expanded across almost all of Central and Western Europe in the late Bronze Age, representing the most culturally and militarily advanced power anywhere in Europe. They were able to assemble and arm thousands of warriors and conduct warfare on a mass scale. Against such a cultural, economic, and military force, the seemingly decentralized and more egalitarian society of Middle Bronze Age Portugal stood little chance. By the end of the Bronze Age, much of Portugal was dominated by and absorbed into the Proto-Celtic-led tribes, likely establishing their power through not only force, but through economic, cultural, and spiritual sophistication. By around 1100 BC, most of Portugal had adopted Urnfield-style cremation burials. Now, cremation makes it harder to get genetic results from the period itself, but studies have revealed that later Iron Age Portuguese were carrying between 12 and 32% Central European Urnfield-associated ancestry. In genetic terms, the Urnfield migration wasn't as transformative as the Bell Beakers had been, but culturally and likely linguistically, it was enough to have a big impact across Iberia, shifting many of the local dialects of Bell Beaker to a Proto-Celtic or Celtic-adjacent form. Unlike the earlier Bell Beaker migration, the Urnfield Celts did not try to replace the earlier populations, but blended with them while retaining cultural dominance. This was made far easier due to the underlying genetic and cultural similarities. Yet many elements of the old Bronze Age Beaker society continued, such as the round houses, which were adopted by the incomers, whose own native style was rectangular structures, which can be seen in Celtiberian sites in eastern Spain like Numantia, where the genetic influx of Celtic migration was most highly concentrated. Now, counterintuitively perhaps, one of the largest direct impacts of the Urnfield culture in Portugal may have been in the south rather than the north. As the Proto-Celts crossed the Pyrenees, they first settled in regions along the upper Ebro River. However, they quickly began moving westward into the region of Tordesillas and expanding into southern Portugal. And this area appears to show the second largest direct genetic impact of the Urnfield-related migrations. And this may support the theory proposed by John D. Koch and several others, who argue that the Tartessian language, which begins to appear in stone inscriptions using modified Phoenician script around the 7th century BC, is at least strongly influenced by Celtic. Herodotus mentions the Tartessians in his histories, naming a king of theirs as Arganthonius, which is widely agreed to have been a Celtic name, derived from the Celtic word for silver, arganto. The massive expansion did not result in long-term interconnection. While there might have been some degree of central direction in the beginning, it wouldn't be long before regional groups ended up completely autonomous, with no further connection to the Celtic core, yet carrying strong elements of the Celtic legacy planted in that dramatic drive west. Around 800 BC, Portugal would begin to enter the Iron Age. The artistic styles that dominated were inspired by their Celtic cousins to the east, though various regional cultures began to emerge, likely in part due to the varying influences of Celtic traditions and languages in different regions. In northern Portugal, around 50% of the place names were of Celtic origin, while the rest were of a closely related Indo-European language. Those who spoke Celtic in the north, around Brega and Porto, were the Galaici, linked to the Castro culture, which built hill forts, but with an increased focus on communal rather than elite power. They give their name to Portugal itself, which comes from Latin Porto and Calais, meaning port of the Galaici people. They would be continually influenced by the Celtiberians to their east, and would share artistic and possibly linguistic elements also. In central Portugal, dwelling on the north side of the Tagus River, were the Lusitanians. They appear to have retained linguistic aspects of their pre-Celtic West Indo-European language, which had similarities to both Celtic and Latin. There is still an active debate whether the language was really more Celtic or more pre-Celtic, but in either case it was heavily influenced, including in their material culture, which largely followed Celtic styles. They occupied powerful hill forts and established farming villages in the lowlands, and though our account of them given by Strabo is from the Roman period, it likely holds for earlier times. He said, "The Lusitanians are reported to be clever in laying ambushes, sharp, swift of foot, light and easily disciplined as soldiers. The small shield they make use of is 2 feet in diameter, its outer surface concave and suspended by leather thongs. It neither has rings nor handles. They have in addition a poignard or dagger. Their corselets are for the most part made of linen. A few have chain coats and helmets with triple crests, but the others use helmets composed of sinews. The infantry wear greaves, each man is furnished with a number of javelins. Some also use spears pointed with brass. They report that some of those who dwell near the river Douro imitate the Lacedaemonians in anointing their bodies with oil, using hot air baths made of heated stones, bathing in cold water, and taking but 1 tidy and frugal meal a day. The Lusitanians are frequent in their performance of sacrifice. They cut off the right hands of their prisoners and consecrate them to the gods. The act of cutting the hands off prisoners and consecrating them suggests a common ritual practice with the Scythians, and very likely the Proto-Celts, as themes around the one-handed nodens, or nuada, equated with Mars, appear to suggest. He goes on to say, they practice gymnastic exercises, both as heavy-armed soldiers and cavalry. Also boxing, running, skirmishing, and fighting in bands. For 2/3 of the year, the mountaineers feed on acorns, which they dry, bruise, and afterwards grind and make into a kind of bread, which may be stored for a very long period. They also use beer. Wine is very scarce, and what is made they speedily consume in feasting with their relatives. In place of oil, they use butter. Their meals they take sitting on seats, put up round the walls, and they take place on these according to their age and rank. The supper is carried round, and whilst drinking they dance to the sound of the flute and trumpet, springing up and sinking upon the knees. Again, these activities were very similar to those in Ireland or Britain or among the Central European Celts. The old annals of Ireland are always sure to remark on the bounty of acorns in a given year. Having walked among the remains of these very houses Strabo is describing, one can really get a sense of the life that he describes. Now, along the central coast dwelt the Turduli, possibly having settled there sometime in the early Iron Age. Their language also appears to be Celticized West Indo-European. Some people believe that the poem Ora Maritima, with elements dating back to at least the 4th century BC, recalls some interesting lore, calling the place Ophiusa. The poem reads, then, after those places which we have set out above, the great bay of the open sea extends up to Ophiusa. Then, from the shore of this place to the inshore sea, where the sea wends itself amid the land, as I have said before, and which they call the Sea of the Sardi, is a journey of 7 days for a traveler on foot. Ophiusa extends its side to a distance, as much as you hear of the island of Pelops. In the land of the Greeks, Ophiusa was first called Westrimnis, meaning the western extremity. Since the Westrimni inhabited the place and the fields, sometime later a serpent forced the inhabitants to flee, and imposed on the empty land its name. To their south was the Celtici, who were, as the name suggests, Celts. Herodotus makes mention of them and their southern neighbors in his work dated to around 450 BC. He says, the Celts live beyond the Pillars of Heracles and border on the Cnesians, who dwell at the extreme west of Europe. Now the Pillars of Heracles refers to the Strait of Gibraltar, and the Cnesians correspond to the later mentioned Cunetes, also called the Coni, both words coming from the Celtic word for a hound, likely identifying them as a warrior people, much like the name Cuchulainn designates him as a warrior. And one of the largest identified towns had a population of perhaps 6,000. However, the Celtic nature of the Cunetes is disputed, because unlike the other Celtic groups in the north, their material culture was interconnected with the non-Celtic Iberian population in southern Spain. Based on genetic studies that have demonstrated a large Celtic influx into the region, though, they were likely at least partially Celticized, but had adopted non-Celtic cultural forms. One notable element is that during the Iron Age, there's a shift in burial practices. The dominance of cremation weakened. In the north, forms of excarnation may have largely replaced cremation. That is, the dead were left exposed to be eaten by carrion birds and the bones to disintegrate in the sun. This is similar to the situation in Britain and Ireland. The Lusitanians practiced a mix of cremation and excarnation, and the Celtici had some cremations and some burials, and the Cunetes practiced cremation almost exclusively. Now, it's been noted that this ties them into the Iberian culture, but the Iberians themselves, as in the pre-Indo-European population, shifted to cremation only under the Urnfield influence, because previously they had practiced burials. This shows an increased decentralized religious tradition with new local interpretations and methods. However, because the practice of cremation or excarnation remained predominant, there are very few genetic samples from the Iron Age, giving us only a limited window. Of all these groups that inhabited Portugal during the Iron Age, it would be the Lusitanians, who likely had the largest single population and who, through their valor, inspired the romantic idea of history written by Luís de Camões, and had a long-lasting impact on the history and identity of the Portuguese. The ancient historian Strabo said of them, "And yet, the country north of the Tagus, Lusitania, is the greatest of the Iberian nations, and is the nation against which the Romans waged war for the longest time." Portugal was already a place with thriving urbanization before the arrival of the Romans. The Celtici, for instance, were named by the Romans as one of the most civilized of peoples, by which they meant urbanized in a fashion similar to the Romans themselves. In the north, the Bracari and the Galaici were dwelling in extensive hilltop cities, with populations likely in the low thousands. The Bracari would create the city of Braga, named for them. During the Iron Age, cities like Lisbon, which had Bronze Age origins, grew and expanded into important trading centers, linking central Portugal to the Mediterranean. The name Lisbon is much pondered over, with some claiming the name is pre-Indo-European, others proposing that it was a Phoenician settlement. There is no solid evidence for either. There is evidence for trade with the Phoenicians, as would be expected in any major settlement involved in trade in the region. But the city was not established as a Phoenician colony. At most, the Phoenicians had a trading outpost there. The name, known as Olisipo during the Roman period, appears to be of a pre-Celtic Indo-European origin, containing the elements olis and ipo. There are a number of place names in the Lusitanian regions which end in ipo, such as Colipo, now the city of Leria, north of Lisbon, and Cantipo, whose location is unknown but is recorded in a Roman source. By the time of the Roman histories, the Celtici in the south were largely urban, having established cities of the Lago Brega, modern Lagos, Miro Brega, whose remains lie just outside Santiago de Caquium. The nearby Turdetani are given high praise by later writer Strabo. They were heavily engaged in mining, especially of gold, and were also said to have massive numbers of boats, which they would use not only to export the gold, but also engage in the tin trade with Britain, perhaps something that their ancestors had done since the Bronze Age. Yet life in all of Iberia would soon change dramatically with the onset of the Second Punic War, and Rome's entry into the history of Iberia. Though the peoples of Portugal were not especially involved in that war, the Roman conquest of the Carthaginian territory and their claim of dominion over Iberia that followed would set the stage for their further expansions. In 197, the Lusitanians appear to have agreed to pay tax to Rome in order to maintain their autonomy without war, as did most other peoples in the region. Yet the taxes imposed increased dramatically the following years. Rebellion burst out in 194, beginning a period of warfare with the Romans which ended in 179, with the signing of a peace treaty and the reinstatement of Roman taxes. Then, in 155, Punicus, seemingly modeled on the Greek and Roman name for the Phoenicians, led the Lusitanians and their allies, the Vetones, in a conquest of the Cunetes, who were by that time Roman subjects. They defeated a Roman force stationed there, killing 6,000. But when the Lusitanians had conquered the city of Conistorgis, Mummius pursued a smaller group and was able to claim a victory. He was replaced then by Marcus Atilius, who managed to bypass the Lusitanian army and capture their chief city, Oxtrace, which caused them to seek terms of surrender. Yet as soon as Atilius left, the Lusitanians rebelled and launched attacks on the nearby tribes allied with Rome, who had aided their enemies. In 151, Lucius Lucullus was appointed governor of Hispania Citerior, whom the Roman writer Appian described as greedy of fame and money. For seemingly no reason whatsoever other than the desire for plunder, he attacked Vacae, besieging a town called Cauca near modern Segovia. The people surrendered, but he ordered that Roman troops be allowed into the town. They admitted them in, and Lucullus ordered the troops to kill all the men. This was but the beginning of the brutality. Together with General Galba, they would launch a joint attack against the Lusitanians from south and east. Unable to sustain the war, the Lusitanians sought peace. As to the absolute treachery that the Romans inflicted upon the Lusitanians in 150 BC, Roman historian Appian recorded the following. Then he invaded Lusitania and gradually depopulated it. Galba did the same on the other side, when some of their ambassadors came to him desiring to renew the treaty made with Atilius, his predecessor in the command. Though they had transgressed his treaty, he received them favorably and made a truce and pretended to sympathize with them because they had been compelled by poverty to rob, make war, and break their engagements. For of course, he said, poorness of soil and penury forced you to do these things. If you wish to be friendly, I will give you good land for your people and settle them in 3 divisions in a fertile country. Beguiled by these promises, they left their own habitations and came together at the place where Galba directed. He divided them into 3 parts and showing to each their place. Then he came to the first division and told them as friends to lay down their arms. When they had done so, he surrounded them with a ditch and sent in soldiers with swords who slew them all. They, meanwhile, cried aloud and invoked the names and faith of the gods. In like manner, he hastened to the 2nd and 3rd division and destroyed them while they were still ignorant of the fate of the first. Thus he avenged treachery with treachery in a manner unworthy of a Roman, but imitating the barbarian. In fact, such treachery was not in imitation of the so-called barbarians, because if it had been, they never would have trusted such a promise to begin with. Appian said that everyone hated Galba, and that he was an evil man who did everything for his own profit, but that because he was wealthy, he was never brought to justice. The Lusitanians were not going to wait for the wheels of Roman justice to enact any form of punishment against Galba. They would get their own revenge. Led by a survivor of Galba's treachery, Viriathus led the struggle of the Lusitanians against the Romans for the next 8 years. Viriathus defeated the Romans numerous times, until they finally sought and the Senate ratified a peace treaty. However, the man who was to take over military command in Iberia, Quintus Servilius Caepio, felt the peace treaty was a disgrace to Rome, and he obtained permission to harass the Lusitanians secretly, trying to provoke them into breaking the treaty. Then, in 138 BC, he was authorized to launch an all-out war. When Viriathus sent a peace envoy to the Romans, Caepio bribed them, and when they returned to camp, they murdered Viriathus in his sleep. A great pyre was made for him, and his body burned honorably. However, with the valiant leader gone, the Lusitanian resistance soon collapsed, and they entered into a treaty which saw them come under increasing Roman control. The Roman conquest of Iberia marked a turning point in the history of Portugal. In 27 BC, Rome established the province of Lusitania, which largely corresponded to south and central Portugal. Latin would become the dominant language, gradually replacing Celtic and Lusitanian. though the exact timeline for this linguistic replacement is uncertain. However, not all traces of Celtic were eliminated. Within the Portuguese language, there is a large number of Celtic words, with a 2014 study indicating over 3,000 words in the Portuguese language actually derive from pre-Roman Celtic dialects, though not all are easily spotted because of the similarities between Latin and Celtic. During this period, small amounts of North African and Near Eastern ancestry begin to show up in Portugal, likely associated with the internal mobility within the Roman Empire and the diverse nature of the Roman military. The far west of the Roman Empire might have been thought to be safe from invasions, and it had been for hundreds of years. Yet the dramatic and startling events of the 5th century would change everything. In December of 405, the Vandals, together with the Alans, crossed the frozen Rhine border with the Empire. They spent several years ravaging Gaul, before in 409 they crossed the Pyrenees to lay claim to all of Iberia. The Hasdingi tribe of the Vandals claimed the north, the Suebi claimed the northwest in Galicia and northern Portugal, the Silingi the south, and the Alans, the Ironic-speaking people allied with the Vandals, claimed Lusitania, which included most of central and southern Portugal. Perhaps in a different timeline, the Portuguese might be speaking some Iranian language, but the Alan control of the region would last only about 8 years. In 418, the Visigoths, acting as foederati of Rome, were asked to restore Roman power in Iberia. King Walia of the Visigoths crossed the Pyrenees and fought both the Silingi and the Alans. Attices, the king of the Alans, was killed in battle, along with the majority of their warriors, and the Silingi were routed. The survivors of the Alans fled to the protection of the Hasdingi Vandals, led by King Gunderic, who was beseeched by the survivors to take the crown of the Alans. He was soon forced into battle when the Suebi decided to switch to the Roman side and launch a joint attack against the Hasdingi. He retreated south to Hispania Baetica and was there made king of the Silingi Vandals. With his now united force of Vandals and Alans, Gunderic defeated the Suebi and Roman attacks and maintained his position in Iberia for years to come, until his half-brother and successor, Gaiseric, would lead the Visigoths and Alans into northern Africa in 428. With their departure, the Suebi would take the chance to expand their control, taking central and southern Portugal, and at their height, almost all of Iberia. Unlike the rather ephemeral occupation by the Alans over Lusitania, the Suebi kingdom of Galicia and northern Portugal did actually take root. While Visigothic settlement and rule was focused on central Spain, the Suebi established their capital in the city of Bracara Augusta, modern Braga. It's a rainy place, perhaps the wettest place in all of Iberia. I got to experience it firsthand in April of this year, but it was very good for the small-scale Suebi farming. Even into the modern day, their particular farming style shaped the regional culture. Many artifacts, including swords, have been recovered from their settlement and rule in northern Portugal, and key places in the early history of Christianity in the region were also founded by the Suebi. Dume, a very important monastery just outside Braga, was the site of the Suebi bishopric, and the most famous bishop there, Saint Martin of Braga, is credited with converting the Suebi from Arianism to the Nicene Christianity. He was also responsible for the Portuguese, alone among Romance languages, changing the days of the week from the names of the Roman gods to numbers. He said, "For the infidels have angered God, and do not believe wholeheartedly in the faith of Christ, but are such disbelievers that they place the very names of the demons on each day of the week, and speak of the day of Mars and of Mercury and of Jupiter and of Venus and of Saturn, who never created a day, but were evil and wicked men among the race of the Greeks. Though the Germanic tribes would eventually abandon their language in favor of the local Latin dialect, they had a large impact on the origins of Portugal. Even the name Portugal is believed to come from Portucales, the city of Porto today, which began as a small Roman port, but which became the most important port in the Suebi kingdom. In terms of personal names, it's difficult to tell which might date to the Suebi and what might date to the later Visigoths, but at least in northern Portugal and Galicia, much of the Germanic influence is likely from the Suebi. They had settled there in sizable numbers and ruled from 409 to 586, and they also had some genetic impact as well. Y haplogroups associated with Germanic male ancestry are not uncommon in northern Portugal. Some genetic samples from the period do show increased levels of Central European ancestry, but the overall impact was relatively small. In 586, the Visigoths obtained full control over the Suebi and eliminated their separate kingdom. Yet the people themselves didn't go anywhere. They remained in northern Portugal and Spain, and blended with the earlier Iron Age population. Their elite continued to act as regional administrators under the authority of the Visigoths. As a distinct people, they are last mentioned in the 10th century in a gloss as to what various people call the plum tree. During this period, Portugal south of the Tagus was a region of contention, passing from the Alans to the Vandals to the Visigoths to the Suebi, then to the Visigoths. A sliver of the southeast even shortly came under the control of the Eastern Roman Empire around 552. Yet for the most part it was under the control of the Visigoths, who had established their capital in Toledo. In Portugal, Braga was the religious and judicial center of power, while Lisbon was increasingly developing into an important commercial center. The Visigothic kingship was, like in most traditional societies, not strictly hereditary. The elites of the Visigoths would assemble and elect a king. Yet following the conversion from Arianism to Catholicism, the church gained far greater power within the state, with bishops sometimes functioning as legal and financial administrators. In 654, Visigothic law was codified in the Lex Visigothorum. Before this, there was Roman law for the original inhabitants and Visigothic tribal law for the Visigoths. Likely a similar situation existed among the Suebi. The Visigothic laws were largely abolished, and Roman customs were adopted in their place. One significant change to the laws, however, were stiffer regulations against Judaism. It seems that at some point during the Roman Empire, a large number of Jews had come to reside in Iberia, although it's possible that they were present in some Punic settlements from a much earlier period. It isn't clear how many resided in Portugal, but at least some were present in Braga, Porto, and Lisbon, engaged in mercantile activities and other trades. Starting soon after the adoption of Catholicism, strict laws against Jewish practices and their holding of public office began, and were codified in the Lex Visigothorum. One reads, "No Jew shall circumcise his sons or practice his rites. If he does, he shall be punished by death and confiscation of goods." There were some attempts to forcibly convert Jews to Christianity. In the Fourth Synod of Toledo in 633, it was declared, "God is thanked for this, that King Gintilla had lately, by a decree, ordered that all Jews should be obligated to leave Spain, and that only Catholics should be allowed to dwell in the country. In agreement with the king and the nobility, etc., it is at the same time decreed that every future king, before ascending the throne, together with other oaths, shall be required to take this, that he would not tolerate Jewish unbelief, and would uprightly maintain the present laws. If he violates this oath, let him be anathema before God, and food for eternal fire. Yet despite this decree of expulsion, the expulsion never seems to have occurred. Instead, at every subsequent synod, there are more and more decrees trying to separate the Jewish community from the Christian one. Perhaps the reason can be found in an earlier decree stating that many clerics and laymen in the past have allowed themselves to be bribed by Jews and have protected them. Whosoever does so in the future is to be anathematized and excommunicated. These laws were obviously deeply resented by the Jewish community, and so even if they hadn't been previously conspiring, they certainly would have had strong motivation to do so, and to seek the downfall of Visigothic Iberia. In 673, the Visigothic province of Septimania entered into rebellion, led by Hilderic, the Count of Nimes, who proclaimed himself king. Yet standing behind him, in stalwart support, was the wealthy and influential Jewish community. King Wampa, elderly and busy dealing with raiding from the Basque people, sent a man named Flavius Paulus to deal with the rebels, giving him command of several thousand men. Yet when Paulus arrived in Septimania, he not only revealed himself to be a traitor, but became the very leader of the rebellion. Flavius Paulus, as his name reveals, was not a Goth, and in fact he may have been ethnically Jewish himself. Paul is, after all, a Jewish name. Due to earlier decrees implemented by the Visigoths, many Jews had either been forcibly converted or had willingly converted to Christianity in name, but still considered themselves Jewish and practiced their religion in secret. Saint Julian of Toledo was influential among the Visigoths in pursuing harsher and harsher measures against what he saw as a growing Jewish threat to the Visigothic state and Christianity. The belief that Jews were playing a central role in the downfall of the state was re-emphasized in future synods under King Egica, who said that he had heard of extensive Jewish support for the Islamic Caliphate, were, as of 694 in the 17th Synod of Toledo, sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. Thus, the enslavement of all Jews was called for by King Egica and Saint Felix, the Archbishop of Toledo. However, just like earlier orders of expulsion, the decree appears to have never actually been enforced. When Egica died, his son, Witiza, who had been co-ruling with him, took the throne. At this point, there are few records available, perhaps owing to the deteriorating condition of the state. Some of the Visigothic nobility were not happy with him assuming the crown, subverting the normal method of election. Later histories remember him as being a weak leader. However, it was under Witiza that the reign of the Visigoths entered its twilight, and later histories may have unfairly blamed him. Chief among the challenges he faced, looming like a storm cloud sweeping from the east, were the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate. Already in 648, the Byzantine-controlled Exarchate of Africa, the successor of the earlier Vandal state, was under attack by the Islamic armies. But in 698, the Umayyad organized a force of 40,000 and marched on Carthage. The Visigoths had been enemies of the Byzantines in recent past, but seeing the imminent danger to themselves, Witiza dispatched possibly 1,000 elite Visigothic warriors to help defend Carthage. They died valiantly, but the Islamic forces easily took the city, leveled it to the ground, and continued their march west. Details of Witiza's demise are very uncertain, but by 710, Arabs and Berbers were already raiding and pillaging the south coast of Iberia, and this led to further internal turmoil in the state. In this chaos, Roderick, a commander in the military, emerged and seized power in the south and southwest, including Lusitania. It's believed that he staged a military coup, but if he killed Witiza or initiated the coup after the king had died and was trying to hand power to Aquila, possibly Witiza's son, is uncertain. He was unable to secure control in the north of Spain and Portugal, where Aquila had also claimed the throne, but really he never had time to try. For the histories are certain about one thing in this confusing period. The only real thing Roderick had time to do was marshal what troops he could and ride desperately to the defense of the kingdom. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, an Umayyad commander, led a force of around 7,000 unopposed across the Strait of Gibraltar. As word reached Roderick, he hastily assembled his forces and rode out to meet them, perhaps around Medina Sidonia. It was a hot day in July when the two armies met across a dry field in southern Spain. Nothing truly is known about the battle, but we do know that the Visigothic knights fought valiantly, led by their brave king, who did not hold back behind his troops, but fought in the van, rallying his men's courage even as the overwhelming forces of the Umayyad swept over them. Many fought bravely to the death alongside their king, but the crows would come that evening to rest upon the corpses of Roderick and his men. The Islamic armies continued their conquest. Due to the disorganization of the state, Roderick's doomed attempt was the only significant resistance that the Islamic conquest faced, though later commentary tends to focus on the religious aspect of the conquest. The contemporary Christian chronicles instead spoke about the ethnic nature, calling the conquerors Berbers and Arabs, and remarking little on their religion. Those of North Africa had only just been converted to Islam through Arab conquest, and they made up the majority of those invading Iberia. At this point, their religion was only a fig leaf accepted in order to be incorporated as equals into the caliphate, though it would become a much more important feature over time. By the end of the year, Toledo had fallen to the Umayyad, and St. Felix, the bishop of the Visigoths, had been martyred. Tariq was made the governor of Umayyad Iberia. The widow of Roderick was forced into marriage with his son, Abd al-Aziz, whom she conspired and succeeded in killing. Lisbon and central regions of Portugal came under Arab and North African rule by 714, with only limited resistance due to the complete political collapse. It's from this later conquest period that another genetic addition is brought into Portugal. There is a rise in the amount of Arab, North African, as well as some sub-Saharan African ancestry, which can be directly attributed to Islamic rule and represents the colonialist activities of the Caliphate. Sites like Santarém were strongly shifted towards African ancestry, but other places far less so. This was not necessarily south versus north distribution. It also wasn't exclusively male-driven, but included the addition of African mtDNA. Now, if we put this genetic information into a real-life context, we see that Africans, including some sub-Saharan Africans, were resettling in Portugal during the Islamic period, sometimes bringing women with them, sometimes taking local wives. Alongside this, there was strong pressure for local people to convert to Islam, so that they would not be second-class citizens. The treatment by the new overlords depended on the location, with Christians generally continuing to follow Visigothic law. A number of churches were gradually seized and turned into mosques, and many of the church leaders and monks fled to Italy. This process happened fairly rapidly because the Islamic occupation would not go unchallenged for long. In the more wild and frigid north, deep in the mountains and valleys where since the Age of Bronze the peoples forged in the fires of history dwelt, a new fire was stirred in the embers of a people. While they had accepted the integration of Suebi, and gave way to the Visigoths. This new occupation was different. The origins of the reconquest of the lands which would become Portugal were born in the rugged mountains of Asturias. Just 11 years after the Arabs and Berbers had conquered almost all of Iberia, Pelagius, a local Asturian noble, likely of local Romano-Celtic origins, rallied the warriors of his people and entered into rebellion. When the Muslim forces came to attack, they were ambushed in the mountains by Pelagius and destroyed. While initially just an attempt of the local alliance of tribes to maintain independence, as the new state grew in power, so did its ambitions. As it would turn out, the kingdom of Asturias would form the launching point of the Reconquest, and Pelagius would go on to be the forefather of the kings of Castile, Leon, and Portugal. In 868, over 150 years after the Islamic conquest, Vimara Perez, a vassal of King Alfonso III of Asturias, won control over the cities of Braga and Porto. The region was named the County of Portugal, from the name of the city of Porto-Celts, now simply called Porto, and Vimara Perez served as its first count. A few decades later, the region of Coimbra to the south was likewise captured. Further expansion in the region was hurt by infighting. After Alfonso III died, the kingdom of Asturias was split apart by his sons, creating the new kingdom of Galicia and the kingdom of Leon. Portugal passed back and forth between both. This was soon followed by heavy Viking raids and a counter-offensive by the Al-Andalusian Muslims, who in 985 reconquered Coimbra and sacked Braga. Yet the internal contradictions within the then-named Caliphate of Cordoba spilled over in 1009 into a bloody civil war that divided the Islamic Caliphate into several rival emirates. This breakdown of Andalusian power allowed the northern kingdoms to regain the momentum. Ferdinand, King of Leon, won back control of Coimbra and had himself crowned Emperor of Spain in 1056, showing the growing confidence and power. Added to this, the notion of the Holy War was gaining traction across Western Europe, and the Iberian Christian kingdoms were to get a massive boost in support from the Franks, Normans, English, and others as they continued their struggle against the Islamic forces. In 1086, Duke Odo of Burgundy, along with Raymond of Burgundy, son of the Count of Burgundy, and his younger cousin Henry, came with their army to Iberia to do battle against the Moors. Henry would be made Count of Portugal in 1096 and wed Emperor Alfonso VI's illegitimate daughter, Teresa. Portugal was reformed as an independent county, though Henry died in a siege as he tried to conquer Leon after the death of Teresa's father. He began a dynasty which would shape the modern Portuguese state. Following Henry's death, his wife was locked in a power struggle with her half-sister, the Queen of Leon, and the Moors had launched new attacks, retaking the region of Santarém. Both these daughters of Alfonso VI were obsessively power-hungry. By 1116, they were at war with each other, with Teresa having declared herself Queen of Portugal, and even getting Pope Paschal II to recognize her position. She made a marriage alliance with her lover, the Galician Count Fernando Perez, which earned her the ire of her first son, Alfonso, and many others in Portugal. She was defeated by her sister in 1120, but allowed to go free if she ruled as a vassal of the Kingdom of Leon. In 1128, her son, supported by the Archbishop of Braga and the majority of the nobles and warriors, launched a coup against her rule and sent her into exile in Galicia. In 1139, following a massive victory over the far more numerous Moors in the Battle of Urique, Alfonso's warriors declared him the King of Portugal. However, due to the dynamics of the Catholic Church at the time, he had to seek papal permission for this independence, which he obtained only by having Portugal as a vassal of the papacy. Yet this more direct papal link to Portugal would actually aid Alfonso's chief aim, which he declared to Pope Innocent II, swearing to force the Moors and Muslims from Iberia. It was a task he set to work on immediately and diligently, and he would do so with a little help from France. In 1147, Pope Eugene III authorized the Second Crusade to also include Leon and Castilla's efforts against the Moors. When ships of crusaders setting out from Devon, England, also including Germans, Flemish, and some French, met with bad weather, they were forced ashore at Porto, where they were convinced to meet with the newly crowned Alfonso. Alfonso convinced them to help him take the city of Lisbon from the Almoravid dynasty. They agreed in exchange for being allowed to plunder the city and keep any ransom from prisoners. Still, for Alfonso, this was a bargain price for such a competent army. After several months of brutal siege, the city surrendered due to hunger before the end of the year. Many of the Crusaders remained there, while some went on to rejoin the Crusades in the east. While the Knights Templar would become very active in Portugal, holding numerous castles and participating in the Reconquest, under the reign of the first king, it was the warrior Gerald the Fearless who stands as a heroic representative of the Portuguese fighting spirit. He was noted for his stealth tactics in attacking fortresses in the cover of darkness and storms, scaling the walls and opening the gates so that his elite strike force could infiltrate and defeat the unsuspecting enemy. Unfortunately, however, not all in the Reconquest was as black and white. Gerald and his elite band of warriors were being so successful at defeating the Moors that Ferdinand II of Leon, feeling threatened with the growing strength of Portugal, entered into an alliance with the Moorish Almohad Caliphate. When Gerald was besieging the city of Badajoz and Alfonso arrived with his army to assist, Ferdinand allied with the Moors and attacked them. Alfonso was badly injured and taken captive as he fell from his horse, and Portugal had to give up territory to Leon in exchange for his freedom. Meanwhile, Ferdinand handed control of the town back to the Moors. Almost all the tremendous gains that Gerald had made were soon lost. Yet historically speaking, the Portuguese part of the Reconquest was not so long. With the aid of groups like the Knights Templar, by 1249 and the capture of Algarve under King Alfonso III, the modern boundaries of the state of Portugal were formed, making Portugal's borders some of the oldest continuous state boundaries in Europe. It wasn't just a reconquest in terms of religion or political control, it was a repopulation. Recent genetic studies have shown a final interesting development in the genetic history of the Portuguese. Places that had high concentrations of African admixture during the Muslim domination had far lower levels of admixture after the Reconquest. After several hundred years of African migration into Portugal, the Portuguese reversed this process, with populations from northern Portugal and Spain brought in to settle vacant lands, while Moors largely fled or were driven out. By the completion of the Reconquest, there were very few Muslims left in Portugal, and although there was some African admixture, it was significantly less than would have been otherwise. Most of the native inhabitants, if they had tactically become Muslim, quickly reverted back to Christianity. In addition to this, in 1496, King Manuel I signed a decree of expulsion of Muslims and Jews, though Jews were instead forced to convert to Christianity. While much of note occurred over the later medieval and modern period of Portugal worthy of song, its statehood was firmly in place, and its people were still overwhelmingly the descendants of those of the Bronze Age. Theirs is a story of longevity, continuity, and change. A story that has difficult pieces, but is at heart a story of resistance and hope. Even when things look darkest, the future is woven by the threads of our actions. Even as Portugal itself was outlined in the Lusitanian blood of those who lived and died for it, generation after generation renewed in the memory of their fathers. As a national bard of the Portuguese, Luís de Camões said in his epic work, The Lusiad, "Yet sleep, ye powers of Europe, careless sleep. To you in vain your eastern brethren weep. Yet not in vain their woe-wrung tears shall sue. Though small the Lusian realms, her legions few. The guardian oft by heaven ordained before, the Lusian race shall guard Jesus' lore. When heaven decreed to crush the Moorish foe, heaven gave the Lusian spear to strike the blow." I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon, PayPal, through YouTube Super Stickers, or become a member of the channel where you can get exclusive video content and ad-free. I'd like to thank all of my supporters from the bottom of my heart. Your support helps me to keep producing videos like this. And as always, stand tall.